Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're demystifying two of the absolute most powerful, and let's be honest, probably most misunderstood organizations on the planet, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Now, we hear these names constantly on the news, right? We hear politicians debating them endlessly, but how much do we really understand about what they actually do behind closed doors? In this explainer, we're going to look at how these massive global financial institutions shape the everyday lives of ordinary citizens, especially in developing nations. Because whether you're a trader in Lagos, a university student in Accra, or a tech entrepreneur in Nairobi, understanding these institutions is absolutely crucial to understanding the global economy that surrounds you. To kick things off, I want you to ask yourself a massive, incredibly high-stakes question. What actually happens when an entire country just runs out of money? It sounds almost impossible, doesn't it? But just like a person or a business, a national government can literally run completely dry of the foreign currency it needs to survive, sparking an enormous, catastrophic macroeconomic crisis. Okay, let's dive into this. Think about a typical family going through a financial crisis. You know the drill. Their income suddenly drops, the bills start piling up on the kitchen counter, and whatever savings they had just disappear. Well, when an entire nation faces a financial emergency, it looks remarkably similar, just on a massively magnified scale. A national financial crisis means a failing currency, skyrocketing inflation, and this mounting mountain of debt that the government simply cannot pay back. And when a nation finds itself in this terrifying position, that is exactly when the global financial system steps in. So, here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll look at the birth of global finance. Second, we'll unpack the IMF. Third, we'll explore the World Bank. Fourth, we'll break down the global debt cycle. Fifth, we'll get into the controversies and mixed outcomes. And finally, number 6, we'll look ahead at the future of global finance. All right, let's jump right into part 1, the birth of global finance. To understand where we are, we have to go back. In 1929, the Great Depression utterly collapsed global markets, and as countries got desperate, they panicked. They threw up trade barriers, which, ironically, only made the global economy even weaker. Then, before the world could even catch its breath and recover, World War II broke out. That left cities, factories, and entire national infrastructures in absolute smoking ruin. These consecutive, back-to-back devastations basically forced global leaders to realize something major. The world needed a fundamentally new level of economic cooperation. No more going it alone. So, in July 1944, representatives from 44 different nations gathered at a hotel in the sleepy little town of Bretton, New Hampshire. And they famously argued over drinks for weeks to achieve one incredibly ambitious goal: to create institutions that could rebuild a broken world and prevent future economic disasters from ever happening again. Which brings us to part 2, the IMF. And this brilliantly illustrates the core difference between these two organizations. People mix them up all the time, but they have very distinct, specific jobs. You can basically think of the IMF as the ER doctor. They are there to treat acute economic emergencies and immediate currency crises. If a patient is crashing on the table, the ER doctor is the one who stabilizes them. The World Bank, on the other hand, is the physical therapist. Once that patient is stabilized and breathing again, the physical therapist comes in to focus on long-term recovery, strengthening the body, and, in the case of a country, focusing on poverty reduction and sustained development. So what does the IMF's day-to-day actually look like? Well, they have 3 main jobs. First up is economic surveillance. Just like a doctor doing an annual health checkup, the IMF is constantly monitoring the economic health of its member countries to spot nasty problems like hyperinflation early on. Second is financial assistance. If a country hits a severe balance of payments problem, which is really just a fancy way of saying they're bleeding foreign currency way faster than they're making it, the IMF steps in with massive emergency loans to stop the economy from totally collapsing. And third, technical advice and support. This is where their absolute top-tier specialists fly in to help governments improve their basic systems, things like tax administration and banking regulation. Moving on to part 3, the World Bank. Now, while the IMF is busy putting out those immediate fires, the World Bank is looking at the horizon. And World Bank money isn't just handed over as some giant blank check. It funds very specific long-term development sectors. We are talking about massive, heavily scrutinized investments in things like education to build new schools, healthcare for nationwide vaccination programs, infrastructure for huge highway systems, agriculture to give farmers a fighting chance, and energy for large-scale rural electrification. The entire goal here, the whole point of the World Bank, is to reduce poverty by improving the actual tangible systems that people rely on every single day, Now, I know it's super easy to view these billion-dollar global investments as just abstract math concepts, but they translate directly to ordinary citizens. Think about it. World Bank funding means a brand new road connecting a completely isolated rural village to bustling markets in Nigeria, finally allowing farmers to actually transport and sell their crops. It means a clean water borehole in Kenya that drastically reduces waterborne diseases for a whole community. It means reliable solar energy so a university student in Accra can actually keep studying after the sun goes down. These investments literally, not metaphorically, pave the way for better living standards. Let's shift gears to part 4, the global debt cycle. Of course, building all of this stuff requires borrowing money. But here's the thing, borrowing in itself is not inherently a bad thing. Let's move to and see how this builds into a healthy economic engine. In a healthy debt cycle, step 1 starts when a country simply borrows money. In step 2, they responsibly invest those funds into productive infrastructure. Let's say a state-of-the-art power grid. In step 3, because there's finally reliable power, local businesses start to thrive, tons of jobs are created, and the overall economy grows. And finally, in step 4, because that economy is now generating way more tax revenue, the country can repay the initial debt easily. Boom, that is exactly how borrowing is supposed to work. But we have to contrast that with the debt trap cycle. This is where things get dark. A country borrows money, sure, but in step 2, the funds are totally wasted on non-productive pet projects or just mismanaged due to deep corruption. So in step 3, there is zero new economic growth. Nothing improves. And because there's no growth, we hit a wall at step 4. The country completely struggles to repay that initial loan, which leads us right to the dreaded step 5, where the government is forced to borrow even more money just to pay the interest on the old debt. It's a vicious cycle, and it's a trap that ultimately crushes the economic potential of the everyday citizens who had nothing to do with borrowing the money in the first place. Which naturally leads us to part 5, controversies and mixed outcomes. Because these institutions wield such massive, unprecedented power over national economies, it naturally brings us to the controversy. And honestly, to understand the pushback, you absolutely have to understand one key concept: conditionalities. See, IMF loans, they are not free money. The IMF fundamentally believes that just handing over bags of cash won't solve a country's underlying economic sickness. Therefore, they attach extremely strict rules and deep economic reforms that a country absolutely must agree to implement in order to get the bailout. And wow, are these conditionalities fiercely debated. Let's take a super common reform, like the IMF demanding a government remove its popular subsidies on fuel. Now, supporters argue this is just necessary, tough medicine. They say it instills much-needed spending discipline, restores confidence for international investors, and stops the government from bleeding money, ultimately preventing a total national collapse. But critics strongly counter that cutting a fuel subsidy causes intense, immediate public hardship. I mean, almost overnight, transport costs spike, which means the price of basic groceries goes up for families who are already barely scraping by. Critics also point out that these strict conditions basically force a country to lose its national sovereignty, essentially giving up their ability to make their own independent choices. It's a massive trade-off. Finally, part 6, the future of global finance. So the crucial point is this: the world is obviously no longer just focused on rebuilding after World War II. The game has changed. Today, climate change is forcing the World Bank to pivot hard towards green finance, funding solar, wind, and climate-resilient infrastructure. Digital transformation means these massive legacy institutions must somehow navigate an incredibly fast-moving world of mobile banking and digital currencies. We are also staring down massive rising global debt pressures following recent pandemics. And perhaps most importantly for their survival, there are now emerging alternative global lenders. The IMF and the World Bank simply aren't the only options in town anymore. Countries can now borrow from regional development banks or deep-pocketed private investors, totally changing the competitive landscape of global finance. Which leaves us with one incredibly important final thought to ponder today. As climate change, digital currencies, and new financial powerhouses radically reshape our reality, are these institutions, literally born out of the ashes of 1944, truly ready for the future? The global financial system is shifting right beneath our feet, and understanding how these forces interact is really the only way to navigate what comes next. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to keep asking the big questions. See you next time.